Thanks, Barry, for the introduction. I've got Dave Norris and Andy Thompson on as well, who are going to help me out with the presentation. Dave and Andy are in the thick of it, working on cost optimization initiatives and work. They have been for several months, and they're on large scale projects, so they've got a lot of interesting insights. I want a couple of caveats. I'd love to be able to give demos and do some screen sharing, but because cost data is very sensitive and confidential, it's not something we can do with our clients. So I'm not going to be sharing any AWS screens or any dashboards, etc. I have taken screenshots and anonymized some of that information. So hopefully it's a little bit like a demo. And then finally, it's really going to be AWS focused because most of our clients are AWS, but a lot of the principles we're going to be talking about are applicable across the cloud providers. Okay, so let's see if I can scroll down. Yeah, so death of the cost optimization initiative. We're being a bit provocative. Why are we calling it the death of the initiative? This is a really big topic at the moment. Lots of people are talking about cost optimization initiatives. I get invited to webinars almost on a weekly basis from vendors. I have New Relic, Terraform, HashiCorp, AWS, the cloud providers. They all provide webinars on cost optimization, how you can save money, etc. So if there's lots of content out there, why are we doing this presentation today, and why do we believe it's the wrong approach? So this is what we're going to talk about, the initiative, the cost optimization initiative, why we think it's a kind of a wrong approach, how to undertake cost optimization in the enterprise, so at scale, and then using things like policy of code to drive through maturity and automation. So the initiative. So typically this is what happens. A CIO or a CTO, they have a big program about cloud migration, getting everyone to move to the cloud, and it's all going well, but then their bills start to accelerate. So partly the drive to move to the cloud is to get off of on-prem infrastructure and to save money. But what often happens during the migration program, people are moving to the cloud, but they're still running the on-prem stuff as well. So they still have their on-prem costs, and now they have these new costs in the cloud, and these costs are going up very quickly. From a head of DevOps point of view, you want to try and automate a lot of these savings, automate the cost stuff like scheduling, etc. And then from a DevOps engineer point of view, you've got a big backlog. So there's lots of things we can do to save costs. Where do we focus on? Where do we look at? And sometimes in the case of Andy and Dave, you're in a FinOps team, which is kind of a new term now, FinOps, financial operations, and their chief focus is how to save costs. So what does an initiative typically look like? It's sort of, in the next 6 months, can you save me $4 million, something like that? And so typically you find 5 or 10 things to do, and at the end of that time, you're judged on how much money you save. What are the problems with that? Well, there's a real focus on technology and not on changing processes and changing the ways of working that you have with your developers. The initiative will sometimes runs out, and then the funding runs out. So after 6 months, they say, okay, that program's finished, we're done, and we saved some money. Number 3, theoretical savings don't always materialize into actual savings. So we might have an initiative say, if everyone moves their storage to Glacier, their S3 storage to Glacier, we will save 30%, but no one actually does it. So you don't actually make those savings. And then, another area is you build up another silo. So now you have a FinOps silo. So not only do you have to deal with security and audit and compliance, but you've got to deal with FinOps as well. So it becomes another bottleneck. The initiative is treated as a project, which works well when it's in flight, but the bottom line, but it fails to transform the ways of working. So how should you approach a cost savings initiative? Focus on real actual savings and getting quick wins and low-hanging fruit. We'll talk about that. You've got, in a larger enterprise, you've got to have observability and monitoring. You've got to understand where your costs are and where you're spending your money. you've got to engage the enterprise, and we're going to talk a little bit about opting in versus opting out policies, and leaving a legacy, which is leaving ways of working, automating these ways of working, and automating policies of code so that they are so that you get long-term benefits. Skip that slide. So the enterprise, doing it at scale. So Devoteam, we're very interested in doing in the scale problems at the enterprise. When you look at cost optimization webinars or talks, they're typically focusing on one account or a handful of accounts. So if you have an account, look at right sizing your instances, looking at shutting off unused infrastructure, etc. It's easy to say, looking at right sizing your instance if you've got a handful of accounts. If you've got hundreds of accounts with thousands of EC2 instances, it becomes a very different exercise in going through all of those instances and trying to right size them. So when we're looking at enterprises with hundreds of accounts, thousands of resources, 7-figure monthly bills that are going up very quickly. So I was saying to Barry earlier, some of our clients are spending over £1 million a month on cloud costs. And then you've got hundreds of teams using these resources. And some of the hurdles we've encountered is just getting started. Where do I start? If you're in a brownfield site, people have already started their migrating to the cloud. You've already got all these accounts. It's only after you've started the migration you realize the costs are going up very quickly. What do I do first? We talk about discovery. So discovery is really important in understanding where to start, to understand where your costs are happening. Having an enterprise strategy that's tied in with your other cloud and DevOps strategies, and it's not something that's running in a silo. And then getting adoption through large-scale numbers of teams and developers. So if you're at your desk, this is a quote from Andy. If you're at your desk and you're asked, okay, can we save £6 million or dollars by the end of the year? What do you do? And again, we say, you can look on the internet. There's lots of content on the internet about how to save money at small scale, but it doesn't tell you how to save money at an enterprise level necessarily. So getting started, where do we start? We talked about low-hanging fruit, removing unused infrastructure. This is kind of the obvious stuff. Turning off sometimes we set up sandbox accounts or POC accounts, testing accounts, get rid of them when they're not used. That's kind of the obvious bit. The second and third points, identifying and targeting high cost areas. And the third bit is intelligence. So finding out bad behavior, codifying good behavior. And I think this bit is really important. How to, policy as code, which we'll talk about in a bit. It's rather than looking at it as a hindrance or a blocker to what you're trying to do, looking at it as a way of codifying good behavior. Instead of having a negative connotation, let it have a positive connotation. So the high cost areas and intelligence. So this is the kind of stuff we're undertaking, high cost areas. So some of the obvious stuff is storage and lifecycle policy. So most of the cloud providers will have tiering of storage. Amazon, of course, has Glacier. So whether you need your access to your data in seconds, in minutes, in days, or in weeks, and depending on those access requirements, you can move your storage to the right tier and you can save a lot of money. That's one of the areas that Dave has been looking at. Containerization. Now this really ties in with a container strategy. So having a container strategy in enterprise, what does that look like? How many clusters do you want to run in your enterprise? I think on a previous slide, I glossed over the point, Google runs their entire operations on one cluster. So they've got one cluster for everything. Whereas you might look at the other end of the scale, there are enterprises running hundreds of clusters of typically Kubernetes clusters, might be ECS clusters. So the idea with Kubernetes is to share your infrastructure. And if you're running hundreds of clusters, you're not sharing your infrastructure, you're sort of defeating one of the objects of Kubernetes. So there's a lot you can do around containerization and tying that in with a strategy around clusters. Right-sizing your infrastructure, that's kind of an obvious one as well, which I alluded to. Only use it when you need it. So scheduling, we'll show you a little bit about how we schedule stuff, retention policies on logs and backups and snapshots, and eliminating unused infrastructure, the low-hanging fruit. What's interesting is the right side, the intelligence. So how to discover what's going on and how to observe what's going on, and then how to observe the effect of the policies that you're implementing. Anomaly detection, which is another one Andy's going to talk about. So looking for anomalous behavior. So if you're spending £1,000 a month on your account for the last 6 months, and then all of a sudden it jumps to 3,000, catching those things early, not waiting for a month to get your bill and saying, oh, my bill's tripled in price, what's going on, but to know the next day that things have changed. And I put an example there. This is something that just happened to us very recently. There's a tick box on snapshots in Amazon where you can have the fast restore option. And if you tick that box, you think, great, I want the fast restore option. And then a month later on our bill, we got a £600 bill for having fast restore. So, oblivious to how much this was costing until a month later when we get a bill. And, if it was my own money, I'd be pretty upset about that. And then policy as code, and automating the policies and having opt out rather than opt in. So it's a little bit the analogy I make that the government, a change that the government made recently was around organ donation. So, it's a bit of a morbid topic, but when you die, typically you've got to fill out a form on your license or whatever to say, I will donate my kidneys when I die. And they weren't getting a lot of donations because people just forget to tick the box. And they've changed using this sort of nudge technique that the government was very keen on in David Cameron's days, is changing that around so that by default you do donate your kidney if you die in a car accident, unless you opt out. And it's the same with these cost saving policies. We want them to take those policies on by default and only opt out if necessary. And you need high level sign off if you're opting out. If you don't want to turn off your dev infrastructure on the weekend, we want to know why. Okay, so let's get into the details a little bit. One of the first initiatives is observability and monitoring. There's tools like AWS Trusted Advisor. So I've put a screenshot of Trusted Advisor. It probably should be the first place you go to if you're in AWS and you want to learn how to save money. And you get some useful insights from Trusted Advisor, but as I've made the points here, it's not always available to developers. So in a large enterprise with hundreds of accounts and thousands of developers, enterprises tend to switch off a lot of this functionality. They don't want every Tom, Dick, and Jane to be able to run Trusted Advisor because it costs money. So they'll turn off this functionality. So it's actually not even available to you. It will only be available to a FinOps team, for example. It's not cheap, and it gives you a lot of false positives. So a big topic on saving money is right sizing your infrastructure. And you can see in the Trust Advisor screen, there's a low utilization option on your EC2 instances. We've tried that, and you get a lot of false positives. So it says you're running a large instance, you're only using 5% CPU, you should downsize to a medium. So we downsize to a medium, and then the app stops working as soon as you get a spike or something like that. And so the right sizing, it turns out it doesn't work, and we cannot downsize those instances. So there are a lot of false positives. So you can't always trust Trusted Advisor. This is an example of a typical example of a screenshot from Cost Explorer in AWS. This is taken from from one of our smaller clients where they run about a dozen AWS accounts. And you can see how important it is to get this sort of long-term visualization. So we were running, this time last year, running at about $15,000 a month. And, going up gradually, kind of coming down in November a little bit, going up December, January. And then all of a sudden in February, March, the cost went way up. And we almost, by March 2020, we've almost doubled our costs from previous August. And that's kind of when the red flag comes up. And that's sort of the anomaly detection is, whoa, why are we going up so fast so quickly? And that's when we really have to, start kicking in with the cost initiative, start taking a forensic analysis about what we're doing and really getting serious about turning off stuff we're not using, et cetera, et cetera. So having the visibility is really important. This is a tool that we've developed called Radar. It's based on a graph database, Neo4j, if you're familiar with graph databases. And what it does is it can query all your resources in any cloud provider, AWS, Azure, GCP, and on-prem. and it can give you really good insight. So, for example, this query written in a language called Cypher, it's a little bit like SQL for graph databases. We're looking for resources which have a tag called TF module name, so Terraform module name and Terraform module version. So this is all keyed on a tagging strategy, which Andy will talk about in a minute as well. But using a discovery tool like this, we can find out what stuff has been built with a Terraform module, for example, AWS EKS, and what version of the module, of the Terraform module, was used to build this infrastructure. And using these kinds of discovery tools, we can then discover how many EKS instances are running in the enterprise, how many ECS instances are running. We can do the same with Lambdas, how many Lambdas are running and which versions of Lambdas are running. And so learning to shut down older versions or help upgrade people on older versions. So having a discovery tool like this, whether it's a homegrown one or whether you buy one off the shelf, things like I think Cloud Custodian can help. It's really, really key to getting insights into what resources you're consuming on the internet and the volume. So in this case, we found out that there were 50 EKS clusters running, and that brings up a whole other question: why are you running 50 Kubernetes clusters? It doesn't feel right, and you can start tying that into your container strategy. This is where I hand over to Andy and Dave. I think Andy's going to talk about anomaly detection. So I'll hand over to Andy. Thanks. I got to unmute you, I guess, Andy, don't I? Let me just.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so I'll run through a few of the techniques we're using in the field and give you an example on this, covering anomaly detection, some tagging strategy stuff, and a little bit more about detail about the policies. So this is anomaly detection, and this can help you quickly detect spikes in your resources, as Graham said, rather than getting to the end of the month. So what does it look like in detail? So you can have a Lambda that's running on a schedule, and this hooks into your AWS organizations. So you can pull in the Cost Explorer data here for all your accounts. And what you can do for each account is you can grab a daily spend, you can then pull back and grab the week's average, and then you can perform a calculation based on some thresholds that you can define, either an increase in actual monetary spend or an increase in the percentage that you spend. Based on that, you could decide to send out an alert. So then you could send an email out to the account owner. And so you can see on the right, there's a screenshot of what this might look like. And what you're trying to do here is not centralize this and tell people off, but really promote cost awareness and help these teams, give them the information that they need. So you can see there's a part here that the most interesting bit is, what do I need to do? We're talking them through it. Have a look, see if you think this cost is justified. If not, you can get rid of it. If you've got any problems, you can get back to us. And at the bottom of the email, what we include is a link back to their Cost Explorer and details of all the information to show why this looked like an anomaly. So they can click on that link, bring up Cost Explorer, they'll see the same numbers there. And then from there, it's quite easy within an account to drill down and see why your costs went up or down. And one of the things that really makes this useful is this is based on your actual costs in Cost Explorer. So you can have policies that are running, say, in Terraform Enterprise or some of the open source policy checkers. And when you actually deploy your infrastructure, they'll go and look up a cost and say, oh, that's a big EC2 instance, that's over budget. And they can stop stuff at that point. But what this can also do is include all your costs. So that includes data transfer and utilization of resources. So it's your real bill. So it captures a lot more. And when we deployed this, we thought, okay, we're going to catch when a developer spins up a large EC2 instance accidentally or something like that. And it does do that very effectively. What we also found was it can catch other costs that we weren't expecting. So it's got some unexpected benefits. So in one instance, it reported a spike for one of our clients in S3 download costs of data transfer. And we engaged with the client and had a look, and what they found out was that their application actually provided a service to customers allowing downloads, and they were in beta. And they hadn't actually realized that there was this large cost associated with the downloads. So through this anomaly detection process, they were able then to start looking into this and feed that back into the charges that were passed on to the customer. So they got a better ROI on their service, and they didn't end up selling something too cheap. Do you pop onto the next slide, Graham?
Yep. sorry. Is that the next one?
Yeah, that's the next. Oh, nearly there. There we go. So yeah, tagging strategy. So this is just one of the useful techniques you can use with tagging. So in this instance, what we have in an account is a Lambda that's deployed, and there's a tag here. It's a little bit small on the screen, but this is a tag with a key value of schedule. And within the actual value of the tag, you'll see it's very granular. And what this goes into is for each day, it's got a stop and start time. And so you can deploy this Lambda centrally into your accounts, but then the teams themselves can manage this tag. And what this Lambda will then do is stop and start in the instances based on what times you put here, and it can send notifications out to Slack. And why this is really useful is if you're running in an enterprise, you're going to have some development teams in India, some in China, US, Eastern Europe. If you try to centrally turn stuff off in the evening, there isn't really an evening, and you're going to have to manage a lot of complexity. Whereas you can pass that to the teams and say, here you go, all you've got to do, we've deployed the Lambda, all you have to do is fill in this tag, put in the times you want, and you can save money. And there's very little effort there and a nice win on cost savings. Yeah, on to the next slide. And so a little bit more about tagging. As Graham said, there's lots of really good online resources about cost allocation tags within AWS and other services. But when you come into an enterprise, what you actually find is if this process hasn't been followed before, the tagging can be quite a mess. And it is really important to get it right, because what you want to do, especially within FinOps practices and cost saving, is you need to know which systems are safe to act on. So a very standard way to save costs is to say, turn your development databases off at the weekend, stop them, restart them. But if you don't know which ones are non-production and which ones are production, you're going to be in quite a lot of trouble. And with the existence of tags, AWS allow you to check a tag exists, and there's a lot of policies for that. But you've got to make sure that you also check that the pattern of the tag's value is correct. And so something we've seen in several encounters is there'll be some tagging policies in place. For example, this diagram on the right, a client had a tagging policy in place that said, you can only create resources if you set an environment tag. So we're enforcing this, and this is a tagging policy. You'll get blocked if you can't. And on the surface, that looks okay. But then when you come to enact that and say, okay, we're going to shut down the non-production databases at the weekend, and they've got a Confluence or a wiki page with their tagging strategy saying all the non-production instances are tagged as pre-production. But then when you actually go and look at the tag, you find that that was just a wiki page. And the reality is that people have put all sorts of different things in there because it only checked that the tag existed. And some of them were even live production instances that were running in there. You definitely don't want to turn those off. So you have to be very careful with enforcing that tag value. And another really important tag is in terms of how do you find an owner for a resource? Because with your different policies as they run, they're going to target certain resources and find anomalies and issues with certain resources that you want to target. You've got to have a way to transition from that resource back to find an actual person to talk to or notify. Now, at a simple level, you can have a resource owner with an email address, but that person could leave the company, especially at enterprise scale. You'll often find there are resources sitting there, and that person hasn't worked at the company for, say, 5 years. And if you're at that point, if you've got a granular account, that's fine. You can probably find the account owner. But if you've got an account where maybe there's 50 projects running and it was set up a long time ago, all you've got is a resource and a dead email. It's much harder to get back to an actual owner. So it's really important with your tags. You can have a resource owner tag, but also have a link back to the project and possibly the business unit it's under. And normally you can have a mapping within a company that then links back to an owner. And even if that mapping goes wrong, you can find that resource. It's going to have a project ID and a business unit, and then you can go and find someone, and you will be able to get back from that resource to a person. So you can end up with tagging that's a little bit dirty and not quite how you expect it to be. So one of the things we do is that we use policy as code to funnel teams into the correct behavior in a safe way. So I'll show that on the next slide, Graham. And so this is a technique. If we take that tagging example from the last slide, what you can do is a 3-stage process to move resources safely into the correct structure. So you can start with your policy will go and it will find all the resources that are tagged incorrectly, and it will notify the users and it will warn them and say, in 2 weeks' time, you won't be able to create this type of resource. In 4 weeks' time, we're going to remove them. And you can set your own time limits based on the particular needs of the business. So that policy goes out and people get their emails because you can't centrally change these tags. I mean, you can, but what will happen is you'll find that these teams are using Terraform or CloudFormation, and it's a declarative state. It will just get set back again. So you want the onus on the teams to do this. And so you can warn them about it and they can start changing things. And then in 2 weeks' time, you can initiate a block. So say on your CloudTrail events, you can have a Lambda that checks that tag and will stop the creation of those resources. And at this point, if they're running Terraform in their development environment, then suddenly they'll find they've got to change that tag and they'll change it and that will work fine. And then the last stage is the destroy stage, where anything that's left that's incorrectly tagged, you can delete it and remove it. And this works as a nice funnel for different types of policies. So for example, this was a tagging one, but if you're doing something like terminating underutilized instances, for example, you could start with a warn stage where you've identified these resources and you've notified users and said, these resources are underutilized, so we're going to turn them off. And the second stage, instead of a block, you can do a stop, and you can actually stop those resources and again send them an email. And then the last stage, you can terminate them and clean them up. And this becomes a pattern where you're giving the team the information they need to act on it, but at the same time, you're ensuring that the company can move these processes through safely and clean things up. And you can target this to non-production. And what happens is the changes made by the development teams will normally filter through from non-production up into production through their Terraform and so on. Yeah, to jump on to the next slide. Thanks. So policy as code. So how do you actually do this? So there's lots of different techniques here. At the simplest level, in AWS, you can use Lambdas. We've done a lot of work with Cloud Custodian, which is some open source tooling that Capital One created. But there are lots of other tools out there, lots of other open source third-party vendors. And if you're just coming into this engagement and thinking, okay, well, I'm going to need to pick all these tools and evaluate them, it's actually better to take a step back and go and chat to the team who are enforcing security policies and account creation steps in your process, especially the team doing security policies, because they already exist probably in an enterprise organization, and they're going to have a way of running policies on accounts that are checking for certain conditions and acting on them. And if you think about it, that's a lot like what the FinOps policies are doing, really. And when you get to a point where you deploy the policy, so let's say a very simple form, you use a Lambda, and you're going to want to deploy that Lambda into all the accounts and give it permissions like stop, start, delete on particular resources. Within an enterprise, there's going to be a process to run through with the security team to get those permissions set up correctly. And it's going to be different for each type of resource because your permissions are quite rightly granular. And so you're going to want a really close collaboration with the security team, find out what tooling they're already using. Maybe you can piggyback on it and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. But that collaboration we find is very effective. And that's where a lot of your problems can lie. If you don't engage with those teams, you'll find all your policies you've written, they look great on your test account, but you're stuck in a queue trying to get these things through security. And as Graham mentioned, opt out, not opt in. If you're working on a development team, you've got a lot of pressures to deliver features and so on. And if it's an opt-in policy, you look at it and you say, okay, I've got to do some effort, I've got to opt in, and there's a risk involved because I don't know quite what's going to happen. So that's not an easy way for me to work. I can just not do anything. That's okay. If you make it opt out, the easy way is the right way. It's just going to happen unless you go through an exception process. And how hard that exception process is can kind of depend on how much pressure is on the company to save money, because the engineers won't actually realize that. If they really need to save a lot of money, then there's going to be opt-out policies. And so at that point, you've got your policies running. How do you show as a group your value? So if the CFO says, why have I got a FinOps team? What have they done? You want to be able to show the effect of your policies. And so one way you can do this is your policies, on one hand, are running probably on schedules against all your accounts. And you can have them log out the IDs of the resources they touch, and you can collect that data. And then on the other side, you can collect very granular data out of your cloud vendors. So for instance, AWS, you can enable daily usage reports. And these will have a large number of entries in them, but that will have down to the resource ID level and the cost for that resource ID, possibly per hour. And what you can do is you can merge that data together. So you can say, okay, this resource ran and it touched these 100 policies, these 100 resources. And at that point, you can merge that and say, okay, and I can get the cost for those resources. And you can generate a graph like the one on the right. Says this policy run, let's say that's a terminating underutilized instances, identified $18,000 worth of resource, and it turned most of them off. Some people opted out, and we can show in monetary value the effect of that work. And this is one side of what the information you want to gather for policies. From the other side, what you really need is the scope. So if you've got a non-production account with 1,000 resources in it, and you run the policy, you could get a graph like this out, and you'd think, great, this is working well. But actually, maybe you're only targeting 20% of the ones. Everyone opted out, or there was a problem somewhere else. So you need to measure the scope of your policy in terms of all the available things we thought it could touch, how many did it actually touch? And what you see when you start bringing these graphs out is that these look a lot like any standard application metric. And it's right, they are application metrics. And what that means is you can then put monitoring and alerting in place on top of these to ensure that the policy remains in place and doesn't spike up in cost. And you can use all the company standard tooling around that for applications and monitoring and support. And then the last piece here, wherever possible, shift left with your policies. Don't create a FinOps silo really here. If you're creating lambdas that you're deploying into all the accounts, maybe they can be deployed at account creation time so that as new accounts come along, it's just the way of working for them. This is how they live. There is a weekend shutdown and it's there. And you're not trying to maintain this separately as a separate silo. You're actually moving it into the organization. And ultimately, you have all these reports and they're showing the effect of your FinOps team and your policies, and then you move them and you shift left. But as you do this work, it's always good to keep it sort of at the back of your mind, the bottom line. Keep coming back to what is your AWS bill, because what can happen with enterprises is you can book out a large amount of reserved instances, and you can do all this work. You can show that your policies are reducing team spend, which is great. But if you're paying for reserved instances, you're paying for them regardless of whether you're using them or not. And so what you can do is this, first of all, creates more efficient teams cost-wise. And then what you can see is you're kind of underutilizing your reserved instances, and you can engage with AWS at that point and renegotiate. And if you're a large spender with them, they're normally quite happy to talk about that, and you can bring that bill down. And that's where your real cost saving comes in, because now you don't have to pay for as many reserved instances. So it's always good, always keep in mind what is the actual bill we're paying, and always come back to that. Don't get taken off track looking at a particular policy. And yeah, that's it from me, I think.
Thank you very much, Andy. So that kind of wraps up what we have to talk about. I think we could probably talk for a lot longer on some of the stuff that we've been doing and getting into more detail about how we collect this data and what the kind of lambdas we run. But at a high level, I think that shows some of the key areas that we're working on. So just to wrap it up, important to really try and get the quick wins and the low-hanging fruit to show senior leaders that the stuff you're doing is working. I think you're going to struggle if it takes you 3 months to come up with sort of a discovery tool, etc., before you even save any money. People don't like to hear that. They want to see savings straight away. So try and find some savings straight away and get some quick wins in. The executive reporting, it sort of ties in with discovery. It's essential to be able to report on your savings, as Andy's just shown on the previous slide. So there's, everyone has got a view of what's going on and what kind of money you're saving and which policies are working and which policies don't necessarily work, and things like who is opting in and who is opting out, which teams are, if your policies are only covering 40% of your estate because the other 60% are choosing to opt out. I think that's really important to highlight that as well. which leads to the third point about the opting out policy. You really, I think that is really one of the fundamental aspects. Is you can do all the greatest stuff in the world and make all these wonderful lambdas that shut stuff off, etc. If no one's using it, if people choose not to use it, you're not going to save any money. So it's really, really getting that mindset shift that by default people do this unless they've got a good reason not to. And all of these things add up to really, rather than focusing on the 6-month cost initiative, and then at the end of 6 months you walk away and you say we've saved some money, but you haven't really bedded in long-term cultural changes. It's really about the policy of codes, the framework, the discovery tools, get them long-lasting so that you really start changing the culture and the way people consume infrastructure. So that is it. Thank you very much. And we have time for questions. So I should unmute everyone, I guess, Barry, yeah?
Yeah, if you could do that. Thanks a lot, Graham, and thanks a lot, Andy. That was really interesting. Yeah, I guess I've got a few questions, but I'll let other people have a go first.
I'm trying to figure out how to unmute everyone. I can see a mute.
Unmute all.
Well, I see a mute all. I don't see an unmute all.
If you press that, I think it toggles it.
Well, I'm going to mute everyone and then try and unmute everyone. Let's see. Mute all. This is really annoying. I can't figure out how. Let me try.
We can unmute ourselves, I believe.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So thanks, Simon.
For anyone, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you.
I'm pleased I could assist.
All right. So any questions for Andy, Dave, or myself? Does this kind of stuff resonate with people? Have they seen this done before?
I think the thing from me, is Simon here, is when you look at the personas there of the CIO, the head of DevOps, and then the community of engineers, we walk into these initiatives just needing cost savings. Where's our money? Where's our money? Where's our money? And it's how do you balance that top level drive for cost savings versus the investment needed to underpin cultural change? So building some automation, building tools, how have you got that balance within the team? Because I know that we've been a hard taskmaster to yourself, Andrew, and Dave, but you do need to find a way, I believe. So what have you done there?
So some of the stuff is, as Graham mentioned, it's targeting that low-hanging fruit. First of all, you'd be surprised at how much money you can clean up just by being smart about analyzing the cloud estate. There's a lot of value out there. There's so much stuff that people have just left running, they haven't realized. So in terms of showing that quick win, just clean stuff up quickly. Don't worry about the frameworks and the legacy code. Just get in and say, why have you got £250,000 running in this sandbox account, something like this? Let's do a tough policy on that and clean it up. And then at the same time, you have to keep in parallel. You start working through your framework and engaging with the security team. What have we got there that we can work with, and start putting in place policies. And the first thing you do is you pull up some whatever analytics you can get on and say, what services are we spending the most money on? And what will happen? Often it might be compute, say. And then you say, okay, let's target compute. There's a lot of other services here. There's lots of fun ideas out on the web about how you can right size all these different things. But let's just drill down into compute. Let's find out where the biggest spend is within that. And then let's work out how to target it and keep coming back to that. Where are we spending the most money? Where can we have the most effect by making a change? And as you work through that, you start building up your framework and your policies. And that's how it grows out into a more of a transformation piece, because those policies you push back towards the teams and start engaging them. Because you may even engage with some just high spend clients, first of all. So the particular account users who've got a lot of money, and you start building it out gradually through that cultural side of it. And always with these policies, you want to put the power into the engineering team's hands. You don't want to be another gate to jump through. You want to say, we're here to help. here's more information you didn't know about how much money you're spending, and even surface that up to the engineers so that they can see, oh, our company is spending X million dollars on compute. That's in the back of their mind next time they bring up that large EC2 instance.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because the other thing I wanted to ask is, how do you come with a lot of clout when you're in a FinOps team. You've got the C-level backing you. How do you take an approach that's not controlling? Because controlling means that they have to do it, and they do it when they're told, and then they revert back. But you've just talked about really, finding how to enable them and using an approach that underpins and educates them rather than tells them what to do and how to do it, only for them to ignore you the next time, or when the funding runs out for you guys not to be there, right?
Well, you put that, and you need that clout behind you, or the teams, it won't be on their agenda to do it. Why would they? It's not on their roadmap. So you need that executive level backing. But what you can say is, this is happening, but you guys can control it. So just as with that policy funnel, you can warn them and say, you need to tag your instances. You need to do these things. But you're giving them time to do it, and you're letting them have control to do that. But ultimately, you do have to push through those policies, because the money has to be saved. Often for some of these clients, that they've got to save that money. The policy has to come into place. You could just try and do a big chop with a knife and just say, we're not doing any of this. We're turning all this off. But what happens is that causes chaos and costs more money than actually doing it the right way. You've got to distribute this out to the teams so that they can own it, but help them as much as possible with services towards providing that.
Andy, a quick question. And how kind of known, how transparent, or how much knowledge do the teams that you work with have of costs? Do you think that this is something that they just don't have any visibility over, and therefore are you blind to it?
I think it's mixed, but often within the engineering teams we engage in enterprise, they don't see the costs the company are paying, so they have a very sort of blinkered view of, based on the applications they work on, how much money is actually being spent by the company, which is always wrong. And a really nice thing to do is to, if you're a FinOps group, start sending out monthly emails saying, this is how much our company actually spends. Just so it's in the back of their mind, and this is the top thing we're working on this month to try and reduce that spend, or to increase efficiencies. But in terms of those teams and what do they actually know, they know about their applications normally. A lot of them are very clever guys, and they know they've had to look at costs to move their applications through to production, but they don't know about the other 200 applications that can vary greatly in use, and so they often have a blinkered view. There are some senior engineers who know more, but in general, it's quite limited.
And
there are some, but there are also, I think there is the concept of regularity of cloud costs that ends up coming to bite people as well. So the few times that we've engaged with some of the larger sort of business functions within our clients, who have high costs that they're not aware are high costs. And the moment that you make it clear to them that actually, if they just made a small change here and a small change there, and you give them the number for the actual amount they can lock off their monthly cost, they bite your hand off to do it. So you have to consider that people develop in cloud expecting that to be the cost. Why would AWS screw them over? But they just haven't investigated any of the extra little functions that they could turn on, little ways in which they could change their behaviours, and get some rather dramatic cost savings.
And Barry, I think we talked about this before the call started, how ironic it is. If you're a startup, everyone's going to see, and you have 5 AWS accounts, everyone's going to see the bills. But if you're in a large enterprise, it's the same as it was when we were on-prem. In a development team, you never see the costs. You never see how much you're going to pay. And and often you don't even have access to the billing dashboards because that stuff has been blocked for the regular user. So it is a bit ironic. Moving to the cloud, you're supposed to get this very much better cost transparency. You get monthly bills and everything, and yet in a large enterprise, the people on the ground never see those bills, just like they did in the on-prem days. They never saw the bills to run in a data center. They're still not seeing the bills to run in the cloud. So it's unfortunate, and it's a bit like Andy and Dave were saying. You've got to communicate. John Smart used to say this: you communicate 3 times, and you're a third of the way there. You've got to continually communicate about what's going on, how much money is being spent, and making all of this stuff visible.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it, I guess, is cultural, right? Like people need to be treating companies' money as their own money to a certain extent. So, and if you've got that kind of ethos within your organisation, then hopefully that will filter through it to people not wasting as much money as possible. I mean, but there's obviously some things that they're going to catch you out on regardless of that. So that fast restore, like the fact that they aren't tying that into like a warning that if you turn this on, this is the impact of that. It is really is totally untransparent, and I think that behaviour needs to be reported upwards beyond the organisation, but certainly needs to be communicated within the organisation and then becomes part of your policies. I'm sure some people may need those fast restores, maybe for a period of time. Like if they're doing some significant upgrade work, whether they're maybe using going up a version of OpenShift or something like that, which can be quite time consuming. They might need that from time to time, but they certainly won't need it all the time, will they? So
yeah, and it's human nature. You forget, right? You've turned something on and you walk away and you forget to turn it off. It's like leaving the light on in the kitchen. You turn it on and then you walk away and you forgot to turn it off. And that just it's human nature. It happens all the time in the cloud. People just forget to turn stuff off, and yeah, it's in the cloud provider's interest. They're very happy when we forget to turn stuff off. So I think, yeah, you're right. It's very easy to turn stuff off and very hard to remember to turn it off again when you don't need it.